On this episode of Newt's World, a significant realignment has recently occurred in public education. The focus has shifted to value data and funding over students and futures. In his new book, Failure Factory, Chris Papst highlights this transition by exposing how academic outcomes are manipulated while students are promoted through the grade levels without receiving the education they need. When students fail classes, their grades are often changed to passing. If schools appear dangerous, arrests and suspensions are no longer recorded. If graduation rates decline, academic metrics are adjusted, making it easier to receive a diploma. What's happening in Baltimore schools is not unique. It is ubiquitous. The new educational mindset, which prioritizes data over students and funding over futures, is quickly spreading across the country, with equally dire consequences for local communities. Here to discuss his new book, I'm really pleased to welcome my guest, one of the real champions and a man who has methodically worked in a focused way for years. Chris Papst is Sinclair's Fox45 Project Baltimore lead investigative reporter. He is a national Emmy Award-winning investigative reporter and the 2023 Maryland State Conference NAACP Vanguard Award recipient. Chris, welcome, and thank you for joining me again on Newt's World.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I appreciate you having me on and supporting this book and this work.
I think what you're doing is amazing. Tell us a little bit about Project Baltimore, which has become, I think, one of the most impactful local reporting initiatives in the entire country. How did Fox45 decide to launch it, and what was your original vision for the project?
So it was 2017, and I was an investigative reporter working for WJLA, which is the ABC News affiliate in Washington, D.C., and the ownership of Sinclair had this idea of creating a 5-person unit to only investigate public education. And the reason that they chose public education is because nothing seemed to make any sense. So if you look at census data, you have a bunch of federal data that you can look at, and you can see that for years and decades, Baltimore City Public Schools was one of the most funded large school systems in America. But yet it was also one of the lowest performing. So how are we pumping billions of dollars into these school systems, and the student outcomes are simply atrocious? So to talk about what's happening right now, 2024, which is the most recent full school year for which we have data because it generally lags a year. In 2024, Baltimore City Schools had a $1.7 billion budget, and 10% of the students who were tested scored proficient in math. 90% of the kids in this school system were not proficient in math, and taxpayers are giving the school system $1.7 billion. How can that happen? Why is that allowed to happen? Why are people in Baltimore City, specifically the public officials, the mayor, the governor, city council, why are they not screaming about the failed academic outcomes in Baltimore City Public Schools? Now, to go back to 2017, 8 years ago, it was the same exact situation. At that point, there was $1.3 billion that was getting put into the school system, and the math proficiencies were 11%. So you look over the past 8 years, and you're seeing an increase in the amount of money going to the school system from $1.3 to $1.7 billion a year. So the school system is getting $400 million more dollars a year. And the outcomes are nearly identical, if not worse, than they were 8 years ago. That was the intent of Project Baltimore, to simply ask the question, how do we continue to do the same thing over and over again? And it's leading to all the problems that you're seeing in Baltimore. We're seeing President Trump right now talking about sending troops into Baltimore to quell the violence and the crime. And Mr. Speaker, I would contend the violence and crime is not the problem. It's a symptom of the problem. The problem is that the kids in the school system for decades have not been getting the proper education. They don't have the English language arts proficiencies, they don't have the math proficiencies, and they cannot properly support their families. The school system is the problem.
Why is the school system so unwilling to modify and change in response to this kind of data?
Well, when I first started Project Baltimore in 2017, a lot of people had said to me, as you start investigating this, what you're going to find out is that the intent of the school system, the priority of the school system, is not to educate students. The priority is to employ adults. And when I first heard that back in 2017, I went to public schools. My kids go to public schools. I didn't want to believe that. It was hard for me to want to think that a school system's priority is not the kids, but rather the adults. But 8 years later, as we sit here in 2025, and as I write this book, Failure Factory, I think that that is the case. I think that when you look at situations like what you're seeing in Baltimore City, you see that the priority is not necessarily educating the kids. And I'll give you a data example for why that appears to be true in many people's eyes. We have a school system in Baltimore City that over 8 years has lost 6,500 students in the enrollment. However, there's about 1,300 more employees that are working in the school system. So you have more employees and more money to educate fewer students. And most of the academic outcomes are going in the wrong direction. And when you see something like that, and this is not a 1 year or 2 year snapshot, this is an 8-year snapshot, you have to look at that and think to yourself, well, this is just the intent. If it weren't the intent, it wouldn't be that way. You would see that the additional money, you would see that the additional employees would create better outcomes for the students, but they're not. It's going in the opposite direction. And then there's no accountability. There is nobody in this school system. There is nobody who's a public official representing Baltimore City that is saying this is not acceptable. These numbers don't make sense. Why are 10% of our kids proficient in math when we have 1,300 additional employees over the past 8 years? What are those employees doing? Why are the students not achieving more? And to go back to your original question, it's because the school system appears to have been valuing the number of adults that they are employing, and those adults making very healthy salaries over the education of the students in the school system.
When you talk to them, if you're one of these adults and you are being paid to preside over abject failure, I mean, how do you cope with that? How do you explain it to yourself?
Many of them come to me and they explain it to me. What I'm telling you is not necessarily my words. What I'm telling you are the words of the people that I've interviewed inside Baltimore City schools, high-level administrators, teachers, the people that are working in the system. This is what they're telling me. And I think that a majority of the people in that school system are good, honest, hardworking people. But when they come to me, they want to be anonymous. They don't want to give their names because they don't want to lose their jobs. And we have seen that when people inside the school system hold the school system accountable by publicly going to the media or publicly going on social media or sites like that, there is retribution against them because there's a lot of money, Mr. Speaker. This is $1.7 billion, and people want part of that money. We can see over the 8 years, and I have this data in Failure Factory, that director level positions in Baltimore City Public Schools, in those 8 years, the salary has increased by 21%. 10% of students are proficient in math. You look at administrative positions, they've increased by 20% of their salaries, and there's many more of them. As the school system is decreasing in enrollment, it's adding administrators, it's adding director level positions, and all of these positions are six-figure salaries where people are making a lot of money. So the people inside the school system that get the pensions, that get those six-figure salaries, They don't want to lose them. And I understand that. As someone who has a family, I get it. You don't want to lose them. But somebody outside of that system has to hold them accountable and say, if you're going to get this money and we're going to hire all these people, we better have better student outcomes. And that part is not what's happening. And that's why I wrote Failure Factory, because people need to know what's going on, especially in these large urban school systems, because that mindset, I can see it in Maryland, that mindset is seeping out into the counties and it's seeping out into the rural areas of America.
Part of what I'm struck by is that rather than trying to fix it, they just tried to cover it up. You indicate that there was an Inspector General report that more than 12,000 failing grades were improperly changed. They simply gave them better grades so they would look better even though they couldn't do anything.
Yeah. So one of the administrators, high-level administrators in North Avenue, and North Avenue is the administrative building for Baltimore City Public Schools. Colloquially, it's called North Avenue. A high-level administrator told me that the school system is prioritizing data, like you had mentioned in the open to this podcast. They're prioritizing the data over the success of the students. And what that means is when students aren't passing, we have seen and we know that they simply change the failing grades to passing. So why would they do that? They do that because it increases the pass rate at the schools. Because if you have a pass rate that is low, there's a higher chance for these students to be dropping out. And when a student drops out, the school system no longer gets the funding for that student because funding levels are based on a per pupil basis. So the whole thing wraps around data equaling money. And if you can keep these kids enrolled and you can keep them passing, despite if they get the proper education, the schools keep the money coming in. I spoke with a teacher who is in this book, who actually gave us her name, by the way, and doesn't work for the school system anymore, coincidentally. She said that the school systems are not focused on educating kids. They're focused on passing kids. Get them to the next grade. Get them from second to third grade. Get them from 8th to 9th grade. And then we talked to other teachers who have said, and we know this is true, that Baltimore City Schools has graduated kids who can't read. You literally give them a diploma that they cannot read. It sounds like hyperbole, but that is where the situation actually is. So how does that happen? How does the kid get to high school and they can't read? It happens because you're passing them along, because the focus is on passing, as the teacher said, not educating the students. It's about the data.
One of the examples you use is a student who in 4 years earned a grade point average of 0.13. He only passed 3 classes, but his class rank was 62 out of 120. That means that half of his classmates, 58 of them, had a 0.13 grade point average or lower.
Yep, that's true.
I mean, he's going to graduate with no ability to get a job or hold a job down or figure out a checkbook or do any of 1,000 things you have to do in the modern world. How do they rationalize it to themselves?
That's why I wrote this book, Mr. Speaker, because I don't know. How do you have a situation like that? And that school is still open. There are still hundreds of kids that go to that school. That school was Augusta Fells Savage. It's a high school where we found this student. His mom had come to us because he was in that school for 4 years and he was still a freshman. He was a freshman after 4 years because he had only passed a few classes and he had a 0.13 GPA, which placed him in the middle of his class. These are the stories that are in Failure Factory. These are the stories that people need to know because that's real. What are those other kids supposed to do? As you mentioned, what kind of jobs can they get? And that's why I go back to the crime and violence in Baltimore is not the problem. It's the symptom. The problem is schools like Augusta Fells. And Augusta Fells is not alone. There are other schools in Baltimore City that have very similar academic outcomes for these students. They don't go to school. They don't get an education, but they keep moving their way through the grades. In the book, we talk about one high school where I got some data that is not made public, but one of the administrators at the school, again, a good person who sees something wrong and wants to blow the whistle, had sent me data concerning reading scores of this school. And this high school, 75% of the kids were reading at an elementary school level. I think it was 10 or 20% of the kids were reading at a first or second grade level. You hear that and you shake your head and you think, how can that happen? And that's what Failure Factory is pointing out. How can this happen? And quite frankly, it happens because it's allowed to, because no one in Baltimore City is screaming. No public official is screaming for better results.
Why aren't the parents screaming?
They are. They come to us. In the book, we talk to a lot of parents. And the problem is that you have a $1.7 billion school system that squashes people. And if you're a mom, you're a single mom, you have 2 or 3 kids, you have 2 or 3 jobs, you make $30,000, $35,000 a year, how are you supposed to go up against a $1.7 billion school system that has extremely well-paid attorneys? You can't. You simply can't. So parents feel powerless. They feel like they don't have any way to get their message out. And that is when they call Project Baltimore. And these are the parents that I speak to in the book that are telling me that their kids' failing grades are being changed to passing. They want their student held back to better learn the material, but the school system passes them anyway. And when they try to push back, there's only so much they can do because they don't have the resources, they don't have the money, they can't hire attorneys. And quite frankly, they're just trying to survive. They're trying to survive in a city that is not giving them the services, specifically the education that they need. And if I can just make one more point about the parent situation here. When we started Project Baltimore in 2017, I was of the mindset, where are the parents? Why aren't the parents doing more? And 8 years later, after we talk about, writing the book Failure Factory, I don't have that mindset anymore because I've now spent 8 years speaking to the parents who want something better for their kids. But many of these parents went to the same school system that their kids now go to. And many of the parents, if not most of them, are also undereducated by this same school system that their kids now go to. There's a woman in the book, her name's Michelle Bradley, and she can't read. She made it to high school in Baltimore City schools. She cannot read. And now she has 2 daughters in the school system. How is she supposed to help those kids? How is she supposed to help them with their homework when she herself went to this school system and she can't read? The parents are not getting $1.7 billion. The school system is getting $1.7 billion. And that money is not predicated on the conditions of the students that they leave when they walk into that schoolhouse door. That money is intended to educate every child, no matter their home environment. And if the school systems cannot educate them, the school systems should perhaps give the money back. But that part never happens. The schools get the money, the kids go into the school, they don't get an education, and it's just year in and year out of the same thing over and over again.
I remember years ago when Governor Kane in New Jersey took over the Newark school system and put it into state receivership. Why have the governors and the state governments not responded to this clearly dysfunctional and destructive school system?
That is an outstanding question. And it also goes back to why I wrote this book, Failure Factory. I cannot get answers. What you get is from many of the elected officials that are in this city is you get historical underfunding, you get redlining, you get racism, you get white flight. You get all these reasons for why the school system is not progressing and why the students are not achieving. What you don't get is an actual answer, and you don't often get school systems that are being held accountable by the officials that are there to give the school system money and then make sure that the money is spent appropriately. Let me give you this little tidbit of information. The only Republican that has any jurisdiction at all over Baltimore City is President Trump and then Vice President J.D. Vance. The two state senators in Maryland that have jurisdiction over Baltimore City are Democrats. Every U.S. House of Representative member that has jurisdiction in Baltimore is a Democrat. The governor, every state level position, Democrat. Every state house and state senator that has jurisdiction over Baltimore is a Democrat. Every elected local official in Baltimore City is a Democrat. So what you have here is complete one-party rule. The only Republican that has any jurisdiction at all over Baltimore is President Trump. So it's kind of like an echo chamber. I go to the governor, he's a Democrat. I go to the comptroller, he's a Democrat. The mayor, the president of city council. I go to Angela Also Brooks. I go to Chris Van Hollen, the two senators. They're all Democrats. And they all say the same thing. They point to the same issues of why the school system isn't doing better. And it's just the same thing every year in and year out, despite the data that we report that we're talking about right now.
There's talk that your current governor, Wes Moore, is a potential candidate for president. I would think that what you're describing in your book becomes an unbelievable liability for him. How does he explain this?
I think he's going to explain it the way that I just explained it. He's going to talk about historical racism. He's going to talk about underfunding. He's going to talk about redlining. He's going to talk about white flight.
How do you, with a straight face, take the third or fourth most expensive school district in the country and explain that it's a function of underfunding?
They're going to say, and this is what they do say, that if you look at the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, now you're right, for the past, I'm going to say 15 to 20 years, Baltimore City has been one of the most funded school systems in America. I don't know what the funding looks like prior to that, because the data that I'm getting is U.S. Census data, is federal data. But they're going to say that it's historically underfunded, even though that historical underfunding was generations ago. That is their argument for why the school system isn't doing better now. However, for the past 10 years, Baltimore City has been in the top 5. It's one of the top 5 most funded school systems in America, and we've already gone over the results.
I mean, one of the things you mentioned, which I've always been fascinated by, is the existence of what are basically ghost students. I think this is a fascinating example of the profound dishonesty of the system.
So the way that schools are funded in Baltimore and throughout America is that you get money based on the number of students who are enrolled. And if you have more students who are enrolled, you get more money. And over the 8 years that we've been doing Project Baltimore, and this is one of the bigger themes in the book, is that the school system, in many instances, inflates their enrollment to get more money. Now, we know this is happening. This is not anecdotal. We absolutely know this is happening. We first broke this story probably about 4 years ago, that there was a school that had students that were enrolled in the school for 2 or 3 years that were not attending the school. We had administrators inside of that school that were anonymous, of course, didn't want to come forward, but they were leaking me information about students in that school that were not actually there. And they gave me their addresses. So we went out one day and we started knocking on doors. And we were asking them, when's the last time that you were in Baltimore City schools? And they would say 2 years, 3 years. And I'm like, you're enrolled. Who's enrolling you? And they would look at the data because I had their transcripts. The transcripts were being given to me. And they would say, I don't know who's enrolling me. It's not me. Mr. Speaker, I found a student who was in jail and enrolled in Baltimore City Public Schools. He got out of jail. I went and found him and I spoke with him. And I said, where have you been? He goes, I was incarcerated. He was dealing drugs. And I was like, have you been to school? He goes, I haven't been to school since 2017. 2017. And somebody was enrolling him. getting $16,000, $17,000, $18,000 a year from taxpayers to educate a student who was in jail. Now, you want to talk about taxpayer abuse. Taxpayers are funding this person in jail, and they're also funding this person to be educated in a school that they're not at.
I mean, isn't it just plain fraud?
I don't understand how no one has been charged criminally for this.
I don't know what percent of the school's funding is federal, but I suspect there's a direct federal interest in this money being paid out for things that aren't happening, which is just plain fraud.
It's between 8 and 10%. So 8 and 10% of Baltimore City Schools funding is federal monies.
And then the rest of it is being funded by the people of Baltimore and Maryland. So they also have a fraud claim. Now, you have really been courageous and determined and very smart. Walk us through this. You end up in this amazing court case where the school district basically at one point just rejects the judge's orders. At the end of all this, the judge forces the school district to reimburse Fox45's legal fees, about $200,000. By itself, this is a great story. So walk us through that.
In 2017 is when I first had teachers coming to me, because that's when we launched. And they were saying that their grades were being changed and that there were kids that were graduating who they had failed in courses required to graduate. And they couldn't understand why these kids were graduating, getting diplomas. And it was because their grades were being changed. So I filed a public records request with Baltimore City Public Schools, which as an investigative reporter is something that I do. It's a lot. It's one of the main functions of my job. And Baltimore City Schools wrote me back and said, we're not going to give you anything. And I'm like, what do you mean you're not going to give me anything? You're telling me that emails and internal investigations into grade changing is not public record? And they're like, we're not giving you anything. And I was like, all right. So we sued them. And we went to court, and I testified for a few hours on the stand in front of Judge Jeannie Hong, who's a Baltimore City judge. And she ruled in our favor on all 8 counts that were discussed in the lawsuit. And she said, Baltimore City Public Schools willfully and knowingly violated the law by not handing over the documents that I had requested. She said that they knew that they were violating the law by not releasing public documents, but they did it anyway. She then forced them to pay our legal fees, Fox45's legal fees of roughly $200,000. And then she forced them to hand over all the documents that we had requested. And it turned out that there was a lot more documents than they had originally told us concerning grade changing investigations and emails from teachers that were begging the school system to stop changing their grades. And it was because of that lawsuit and winning that lawsuit that we got a large amount of the documents that are in Failure Factory that led to the creation of Failure Factory, because we saw how pervasive grade changing was in Baltimore City Public Schools. And it goes back to the data. It goes back to making the schools look better than they are, to keep the kids in school, to keep the money train flowing. That's what this all comes back to.
How much is the highest paid person in the Baltimore school system?
So that is the CEO. Baltimore City Schools does not have a superintendent. They have a CEO. And her total compensation is $500,000, right around there. Now, $500,000 for 10% of students who are proficient in math. And she has been, Dr. Sonia Santelises is her name, she has been the CEO of Baltimore City Schools the entire 8 years that this book covers. Everything that we have talked about, Mr. Speaker, on your podcast, knowingly and willfully breaking the law, ghost students, grade changing, all of this stuff, happened with the same person in charge. And that person has 100% support from the public officials in Baltimore. The mayor fully supports her. The president of city council fully supports her. Every council member, to my knowledge, no one's calling for her to resign. The governor, she's been there for 8 years. Total compensation.
And is that in part just a function of how much money the school district has and the fact that it's not rational for the local politicians to take her on?
I think that when you have a one-party rule echo chamber in Baltimore, which we discussed just a few minutes ago, who's going to break ranks with that? And you don't see anybody breaking ranks with that. When Governor Larry Hogan was here, and he was a two-term Republican governor who left 3 years ago, he did speak out a lot against Baltimore City Public Schools. But he was really the lone voice, and he was a singular Republican who had jurisdiction over the city. There's no other Republican that had jurisdiction over the city. He was the only one. And he spoke out a lot against it, and he got hammered for it. People called him a racist. You know what the climate was like 3 or 4 years ago. And he tried. He said a lot of things. I interviewed him a lot. He called for criminal investigations. He called it fraud when the enrollment numbers were being falsified, but nothing ever came of it.
One of the things you note in passing is that despite the groundbreaking research you were doing and the investigative reporting, the other 3 TV stations and the Baltimore Sun all have sort of avoided this issue. Why do you think that is?
Well, the Baltimore Sun is under new ownership now, and they have taken full stake in these issues. So they have now picked it up. But the Baltimore Sun, under the prior ownership, they ignored it. The television stations ignored it. And I think that it was a detriment to certainly the kids in Baltimore City schools that are being undereducated. It's a detriment to their parents. But unfortunately, we live in a very hyper-competitive media world. And a lot of the local television stations and the Baltimore Sun at the time, they weren't interested in picking up a story that Fox45 and Project Baltimore and Chris Papst were doing. And if you think about it, it's really hard to wrap your head around that, because when you have inflated enrollment, at one point, Mr. Speaker, after we had done a number of stories on inflated enrollment, at just one school, Baltimore City Schools had to refund state taxpayers $350,000 for students that were enrolled who should not have been enrolled. At one school, they had to give back $350,000. And the other media entities in this town did not cover it because it was instigated by Fox45 and Project Baltimore's investigative reporting. It's stunning, really. However, with the Sun's new ownership, that has changed. So there are more media entities now in Baltimore that are saying, hey, $1.7 billion, 10% math proficiencies, maybe we should report on this too.
Look, I think your book is important not only in describing Baltimore, and I think it'll be a major, major problem for the governor if he decides to run, because this book indicates that on his watch, the city of Baltimore is just failing. And it's failing the children. It's failing their future. But in addition, it seems to me, this book creates a frame of reference for other cities and for other investigative reporters, and frankly, for the legislatures and the Congress to look at the patterns and habits that have grown up because you have bureaucracies who care more about the money than they care about the children, and they're so powerful in their community that they can't be reformed from within. This is why what President Trump's doing is so groundbreaking, because you can't, inside Chicago, take on the Chicago system. It's just too big, too powerful. People won't do it. And yet, much like Baltimore, it is cheating thousands of people and creating future nightmares for us when we have citizens who can't get a job, can't read, can't understand the issues. It's a real challenge. The best of my knowledge, you are the most knowledgeable pioneer in investigating all this and in laying it out. And I think that your book, Failure Factory, How Baltimore City Public Schools Deprive Taxpayers and Students of the Future, is literally in the tradition of the great muckrakers in the early 1900s. And I hope that it will be one of the things which triggers an awareness that we have to fundamentally rethink our big cities, rethink the machines, rethink the teachers' unions, and get back to serving people, having them live in safety, having them go to schools that actually succeed, and having them in environments where jobs can be created. And Chris, you are, as much as any single person in the country, a genuine pioneer in developing this. And your work, which I know has to be exhausting and time-consuming, but your work is a real contribution to the entire country.
Mr. Speaker, I'm honored. Thank you.
I want to thank you for the work you've done. I want to thank you for joining me. I look forward to having you back in the future. And I'm going to do everything I can to help communicate that Failure Factory is a vital book describing a phenomenon that's not just Baltimore City, but it's around the country, and it's one of the things weakening America, and we have to address it. So Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you. And anytime I'd be happy to come on and speak with you. I think that our cities cannot survive if our school systems are failing. And Baltimore City school system is certainly failing.
Thank you to my guest, Chris Papst. You can get a link to buy his new book, Failure Factory, on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan, and our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at Gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.